So you complete your PhD in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Say that.
Yeah. Sure, yeah.
Like a decade, like exactly.
Almost exactly. It was March 7th. So it was like almost in 2 months, 10 years ago exactly. I was celebrating being a newly minted PhD and like terrified about what to do next.
Did you write your name?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Does it work? Okay.
Over there, yeah, there's sounders, yeah.
Yeah, this at least I can hear a speaker,
And then you are welcome to this.
but I don't know if this.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, that
Can you say open?
the Zoom people will be hearing through my.
Yes, you're not.
Okay.
So, a little bit unfortunate, so you can't over there.
Yeah,
It's
okay. I can adjust. Usually I like wander around, but good to see you guys. Happy you would be here.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I have a meeting at 12:30, so I can only stay for like a little bit.
Okay.
Are you around?
Yes. And I'm actually in San Diego until August now because I'm doing my I had a baby and I'm
I
doing
know. Congratulations, Mama.
Thank you.
That's
I'm
awesome.
doing
I've seen the pictures.
yeah.
I've seen pics. I've seen
Okay,
pics.
okay.
More later.
Yeah, I'm doing my maternity leave here, so I don't have to teach, and Hans is working in San Diego, so I'm just gonna do that, and then he'll come up with me in the fall when I go back to teaching.
I was gonna say, like, I hope you're not just not in town for a night. Or
Yeah.
something. Stuff.
No, yeah, and if I had been, I would have been like set up meetings at work. But I'm here.
It's so big.
Yeah.
But we can do that later.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, you too.
Oh yes, I am muted. But I do the output from the. So it works, right? You watch muted. Okay. Yeah, everyone is muted. But that's why I use the audio output.
Used to.
Yeah, just leave it as is. It should work. Yeah, and bad, just leave it as is also. It works fine.
The what?
Let me get my phone.
I know. We can talk about diatoms. Yeah. Well.
I'll keep an eye out.
Yeah, I think we can start once this. Okay, hi everyone. Hey everyone, welcome to the SAOBO seminar. And today we welcome Dr. Sarah Smith to give us a seminar talk. I'll do a brief introduction. She's currently an assistant professor at the Moss Landing Marine Laboratories at SJSU, where she actually graduated from Scripps about a decade ago in 2014. So yeah, she's back. And she's a biological oceanographer who studies the ecology, evolution, and the physiology of marine phytoplankton. Her researching lab also focuses on improving the cultivations of diatoms and other marine microbes for the production of renewable biomass used in biofuels, aquaculture, or other industrial applications. So she also studies system biology, genetic engineering, and synthetic biology approach to understand and optimize useful traits of algae reproduction at scale. So let's welcome Dr. Sarah Smith for this seminar talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. It's really fun to be back on campus, and it feels like coming home in a lot of ways. It's a hard place to leave when you have to leave and graduate, but you should all do it because that's the goal. So I'm really happy to be here today talking to you about a topic that, for those of you who know me, might seem a little outside of my primary area of expertise, a bit outside my wheelhouse, kind of a fish out of water here, which is a dumb marine science pun. But I have come to this kind of field through a little bit of an interesting path that I hope to summarize for you today, and to tell you kind of what the current status of thinking is for using ocean iron fertilization towards a solution to this massive CO2 problem that we find ourselves faced with. And I want to take a moment before I dive into this to acknowledge Ken Bissler, who's at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, who is really the lead in pulling a bunch of oceanographers and social science experts and governance experts together in a group called EXOIS, Exploring Ocean Iron Solutions, which I will talk a little bit more about today. But I want to acknowledge his very pivotal and key role in that. I'm on the steering committee of this group, so I know quite a bit about its actions, but Ken is really the one that's driving the efforts there. So I'll start here, which is a graphic that's very familiar to all of you at Scripps. This is atmospheric carbon dioxide at the Mauna Loa Observatory, or Mauna Kea data at the end. And the whole entire purpose of just showing this is just to underscore that we have a CO2 problem, and the number one way of attacking this CO2 problem on Earth to mitigate some of the issues that are associated with global warming and ocean acidification is to reduce emissions. So I just want to start out at the beginning to say that nothing that we propose that may mitigate the climate crisis does not involve the first step of reducing these emissions. But reducing emissions is not enough at this point to minimize warming and keep it under the 1.5 to 2 degree targets that have been agreed upon in international agreements. So what I'm showing here on the y-axis is the amount of CO2 that we emit per year, and on the x-axis is time. And we're roughly here. Let's see if you can see you can see my pointer. Now, with about 40 gigatons of carbon emissions annually, if we continue on with business as usual with this line, we're going to continue warming the planet. And the plan is to reduce emissions through a combination of decarbonize, move away from the burning of fossil fuels, but also to incorporate non-CO2 generating energy production techniques, solar panels and wind farms, et cetera, sustainable energy. And the point of this figure is to show that if we can do that, if we can meet our targets to incorporate more of these carbon capture and sequestration bound technologies or sustainable technologies, we're still not at net zero without incorporating some technologies that actually actively remove carbon from the atmosphere. So that's a suite of technologies down here, which are carbon dioxide removal. These are decoupled from energy generation. They're just focused specifically on taking that carbon out and durably storing it away from the atmosphere. So we really need to invest if we're going to meet these targets by 2050. We need to start thinking about what these technologies are now, do the research that's important to figure out if they're feasible or responsible, and before they end up actually being able to be deployed in the next 25 to 50 to 100 years. So the ocean plays an outsized role in the carbon cycle, and you may have heard in the news of carbon capture and sequestration technologies that have nothing to do with the ocean, technologies that couple to stack gases, for example, and capture the carbon and bury it underneath the earth. But when we really think about where all the carbon is on the planet, most of it is in the deep ocean. A very small proportion of it is found in the atmosphere. A very small proportion of it is found relatively in land plants and soils. And almost all of the carbon on Earth is stored in the deep ocean. It stores 15 to 20 times more carbon than land plants and 50 times more carbon than the atmosphere. So putting a little bit of the anthropogenic CO2 that's in the atmosphere in the deep ocean is more feasible than trying to figure out other places that we can put it. And with this in mind, the National Academies released a report in December of 2021 evaluating various marine carbon dioxide removal technologies. MCDR is kind of the buzzword for that. And they're represented here. They include nutrient fertilization of the ocean, or iron fertilization, ecosystem recovery, this is often referred to as blue carbon, seaweed farming, offshore or onshore, ocean tubes, which can be used for artificial upwelling or downwelling, ocean alkalinity enhancement, which you may have heard about, is kind of like the Tums for the ocean, or enhanced rock weathering to store inorganic carbon in surface waters. And electrochemical approaches. The one I'm here to talk about today is iron fertilization or nutrient fertilization. So iron, to start talking about iron, I first want to talk about, or iron fertilization, I first want to talk about the role of iron in biology. It's really, really central and critical for almost every cellular function on Earth. And that's because cellular life evolved in a high iron and low oxygen world. And iron was highly soluble in seawater. Iron is unique in its properties. It forms iron sulfur clusters and is critical for redox reactions, which are central in most of energy metabolism, in the oxidative phosphorylation chain in mitochondria, in the photosynthetic electron transport chain, and in other key reactions like nitrogen fixation. This is the nitrogenase enzyme. These redox coupled reactions are just absolutely critical. But when life evolved, there was no very little oxygen in the world until photosynthesis, or the water splitting reaction, came along and created oxygen that changed the chemistry and the solubility of iron in seawater. And with an increasing amount of oxygen, iron was no longer soluble at the same level, no longer bioavailable. It precipitated out as iron oxides. And throughout that period of time, life kind of coped with detoxifying the oxygen and allowing cells to recover and scavenge the iron that they need for those critical metabolic processes, while simultaneously evolving new mechanisms. So what you're seeing here are the banded iron formations, ancient marine sediments, where as life was kind of tick-tocking back and forth between an oxygenated environment where iron was not available, and then back to conditions where iron was available. You see this play out in the sedimentary record. So what I love about this quote is it sort of summarizes what I'm trying to say here a little bit more concisely, which is that early aquatic forms found themselves in a pickle of global proportions. They need iron that is no longer available when oxygen is around. And this resource competition for iron, and generally resource competition, acts as a strong selective agent. So organisms were forced to develop strategies to either reduce cellular iron demand, innovate new strategies to outcompete other organisms for iron uptake and acquisition. And I'm not going to talk about those strategies so much today, but I just want that to be kind of present in your mind, that we began to recognize that in the ocean, iron was a scarce resource that organisms absolutely require. So this was not confirmed. Biological iron limitation in the ocean was not actually confirmed until we were able to reliably measure iron levels in the ocean. They are vanishingly low and required very precise and trace metal clean sampling and analytical procedures. And the new analytical and trace metal clean methods developed in the 80s led to the first vertical profile of iron concentrations, which is shown here on the left. And this was near Station Papa, or maybe at Ocean Station Papa in the Northeast Pacific. You can see that iron here shows the same nutrient type distribution, where it's depleted in the surface waters and enriched at depth, as other nutrients that we know, macronutrients, are essential for phytoplankton growth. And that's nitrate and silicate. But what is maybe less evident from this particular plot is that often in these regions where iron is extremely limiting in the surface ocean, you have plenty of nitrate and phosphate and silicate and other macronutrients that are capable of supporting phytoplankton growth. So this is a little bit of a paradox. These regions are known as HNLC, high nutrient low chlorophyll, or high nitrate low chlorophyll, and were confirmed through a series of experiments to actually be limited for iron. So this is one such experiment, a bottle incubation, showing different patches of seawater trapped in a bottle, amended with iron, manganese, copper, zinc, EDTA to scavenge away as a kind of a control, and then a control which is unamended. And what you see is that the phytoplankton bloom, this is in primary productivity over here on the y-axis, bloom only in the bottles where iron was added. So that's experimental confirmation that those communities were limited for iron. With the recognition that when you enhance productivity in the surface waters, more of that productivity ultimately dies and is packaged by the ocean's biological pump and ends up in marine sediments. So with the recognition that enhanced productivity leads to enhanced carbon export and sequestration in the ocean's interior, which is depicted here in this figure, John Martin developed this concept that the supply of iron to the surface ocean regulates global primary productivity and consequently can act as a mechanism to remove or replenish carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And linking this data to other kind of ice core data taken on glacial and interglacial timescales proposed the iron hypothesis, which is that the supply of iron to these iron limited regions of the ocean actually regulates global climate on these interglacial glacial timescales. So this led to the very famous iron hypothesis and the declaration at a meeting at Woods Hole in 1988 where John Martin was giving a talk with this data, and he said, with half a shipload of iron, I could give you an ice age. And he's often quoted as this kind of nefarious character. He apparently used a Dr. Strangelove accent to make this declaration, which is a cultural reference that will probably go over the head of most of the people in this room at this point. It did for me until I eventually saw that movie years and years later. But really, ultimately, the iron hypothesis is built on these kind of three premises. One, iron deficiency limits phytoplankton growth, the uptake of carbon dioxide, and the flux of carbon from surface waters to the deep ocean. Iron limitations are responsible for the persistence of HNLC zones found in over 30% of the oceans worldwide. And natural iron supply from terrestrial sources during glacial maxima contributes to the drawdown of CO2 by enhancing phytoplankton growth. That's the mechanism. And the corollary to all of this, and where this has become kind of a little controversial, is that with this knowledge, we can say that large-scale purposeful iron enrichment, like that means humans going out and spreading iron in the ocean, could help control atmospheric carbon by sequestering carbon in the deep ocean's interior or bathypelagic sediments. So a series of ocean fertilization experiments after this hypothesis was published in the literature actually ended up taking place. And this is just a map of where the HNLC regions in the global oceans are. And in these regions, in order to test this hypothesis fully, a series of 13, and I think there may be actually a few more now, over a period of time from 1993 to 2009 were conducted. And this is probably not news, this is probably familiar to you, but the researchers went out with iron sulfate, it's an iron salt, and with an inert tracer, sulfur hexafluoride, mixed into the surface ocean by laying a patch, and observed what happened to that patch. And in almost all of the cases, a large phytoplankton bloom resulted where there had been no phytoplankton bloom before, thus confirming iron limitation of surface waters. And this is an actual image of what the patch looked like prior to fertilization, an in-patch and out-patch comparison. So you can see these are really remarkable changes because of just adding a little bit of trace amounts of iron. And anecdotally, Ken Johnson, who was the chief scientist on the very first of these expeditions, has described what it felt like to be on the fantail of the ship of the Iron, I think it was Iron X2, where the water had gone from feeling oligotrophic, like Hawaii, where if you've been to sea, you know what that feels like, warm air, clear water, to looking and smelling like Monterey Bay, which is a very, very different ecosystem. So a tiny bit of iron can really fundamentally change the way that a whole ecosystem is structured. This was conducted at such a scale that it could actually be observed by satellite. And this is the patch. You can see that the original patch, which was laid out in a cohesive unit, got stretched by the physical oceanography of the area into this sort of like smiley face thing. I think this was the Soiree experiment that was conducted out of New Zealand. And but this was an impressive result. You could actually see this from global satellites in ocean color. So the question is now kind of how much carbon can we sequester using ocean iron fertilization? And really it hinges on how deep the carbon that is taken out of the atmosphere to fuel phytoplankton photosynthesis goes. And that's what this figure is kind of showing. So here is a patch that's being laid by a ship. If that phytoplankton bloom makes it just into the surface ocean, it may be stored away from the atmosphere on the order of days, weeks, months, or seasons. The deeper it goes, it gets sequestered for up to centuries or millennia if it makes it all the way down. So we still don't actually have a very good handle on how much of the carbon from these iron fertilization experiments is actually sequestered. That wasn't the primary objective of all of those experiments that were testing the iron hypothesis. It wasn't carbon storage, it was, does iron limit primary productivity? I don't think that there's an oceanographer alive who would contest that finding at this point. But, you know, corporate interests come along and see this sort of preliminary data, and understanding what we know about the biological pump, the natural extension is to say, okay, well, let's go spread out some iron, sequester carbon, and sell those carbon credits. And the oceanographers at the time were critical of that approach because those experiments, as I mentioned, were not designed to test that part of the hypothesis. And it was pretty prevalent in the literature that this is unpopular, we shouldn't explore this further as a technique. And I'm putting this piece up because it summarizes a lot of kind of the general concerns in response to the idea of using this for deliberate carbon dioxide removal, but I'll pull some of them out. Critics of this approach generally fall into these kind of bullets. We already know it won't work. Ocean modelers have shown that you need to take all of the nutrients out of the entire Southern Ocean in order to sequester an amount of carbon that would make a difference in our atmosphere. So it's not going to work, or it won't work well enough. There will be negative ecological consequences. The negative consequences range from nutrient robbing or redistribution, taking nitrate and phosphate out from waters that otherwise would move to other regions and fuel productivity there. We may end up generating giant harmful algal blooms full of toxic pseudonychia. There may be hypoxia in the midwater or benthic due to degradation of the organic carbon that's being exported. That would be sort of bad for the organisms that live there. And there will also be impacts on fisheries, the productivity of fisheries, or maybe changing of the trophic structure. There is a sort of generalized concern about the overall concept of geoengineering, which is valid. Another general concern is the moral hazard of it all, which is basically that if we have a mechanism to remove CO2, then why do we have to stop creating it by the burning of fossil fuels to begin with? That's a concern and a criticism of OIF. And another general concern is this push for commercialization and desire for profitability will oversimplify or distort the science. And we've seen this happen in a variety of other industries, so it's not a major extrapolation to expect that that might occur here. So the consensus at the time, and around 2008, 2009, is it's not worth it. It's been controversial, and some folks have ignored the warnings of scientists and the concerns of scientists. And this is an article in New York Times that I think is from 2012, summarizing the efforts of a company called Planktos that went out and fertilized a patch of ocean and claimed that the historic salmon returns that the Haida Gwaii people observed in subsequent seasons was due to the enhanced productivity from this iron fertilization. This was widely critiqued. It violated UN rules, the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity and the London Convention against dumping in the ocean, and was generally panned by scientists, and a lot of bad press for OIF as an endeavor. All right, so why is it coming back? These are very valid concerns. And why is it now something that we're talking about again? I get this a lot from people who hear, haven't we figured out this is already a terrible idea? Well, we live in a new world now. And in response to the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or the 26th COP in Glasgow, which disappointed a lot of folks for a relatively modest movement towards commitments to decarbonize across all of the nations that were participating. Kenneth Cole, who was a chemical oceanographer at Moss Landing Marine Labs, sent this email to some of our faculty. He had attended the conference, and he said, in my opinion, none of the participating countries can make their targets without, he called it CCS at the time, but CDR also fits in there. Yet this was a very small portion of the conference, with most nations focusing on becoming carbon neutral by 2050. Carbon neutrality is not enough to avoid massive climatological catastrophe, even under reduced carbon emission scenarios. So carbon capture is back on the table and gaining attention. This means that iron fertilization is being reconsidered. And it doesn't mean that it's being reconsidered by science. It means that it's on the table, and commercial enterprises are reconsidering it. So in response to that recognition, and also the release of the National Academy's report in 2021, many of the scientists who had been involved in these original iron fertilization experiments came together again to begin the conversation about, if this is going to move forward, how should science be involved, and how could it be done responsibly? And that's what led to the formation of a group called EXOIS, or Exploring Ocean Iron Solutions. And at the outset of these discussions, we met monthly on monthly forums. This was starting in, I think, January of 2022. We developed first a code of conduct. And the code of conduct is shown here, summarized in these guiding principles. And it could be applied to other marine carbon dioxide removal techniques, but we developed it with the idea of ocean iron fertilization. For all these studies, for all this research into developing these technologies, they should be done with an eye to prioritize collective benefit for humans and the environment, to establish clear lines of responsibility to oversee the studies, to commit to open and cooperative research, including risk assessments, perform evaluation and assessment in an iterative and independent manner, and to engage the public in consideration of these climate interventions. So I just want to say that up front. So who are we? I mentioned Ken Bissler already. It's an international group of researchers. This is the steering committee shown here, but there are a lot more people who are listed on the website. Becoming part of this group is not hard. Just send an email and then you can be part of the group. I would encourage all of you to, if you're interested in this, to get on the mailing list or to attend some of the forums to be part of the discussion. The monthly online forums are really great. We're a not-for-profit, non-commercial consortium of experts, and we're all trying to chart a path forward to explore research pathways to evaluate OIF. We've generated a couple of data products. One is the white paper, and this can be downloaded from our website. And the white paper summarizes the state of the science and articulates that we really need new research to address that second part of the John Martin iron hypothesis. Does iron fertilization lead to durable carbon sequestration? Without that, it is a non-starter. There's no reason to continue to explore OIF for marine CDR. with that in mind, we convened a working group of experts across a variety of topics at Moss Landing Marine Labs last spring, almost exactly a year ago. And this is a picture of that group to discuss some of the very specific pieces of how do we deal with the governance? How do we deal with social acceptance? What would an experiment look like? What scale would it need to be conducted at? And if we're going to do this, essentially, what do we need to do? How does it get funded? How do we approach this task? NSF is not going to fund something like this. And really, what's new now? What can we do now that we couldn't do in 2008 or 2009? Where would we go? We spent some time talking about different site comparisons. Where could OIF be deployed for MCDR? Obviously, the major HNLC regions, but some of the low nutrient, low chlorophyll regions as well. Iron limits nitrogen fixation in the oligotrophic gyres, which are a majority of the surface area of our global oceans. Would OIF work there to sequester carbon? What does the next generation of field studies look like? How do we prioritize that? What sort of changes in ocean modeling have happened in the last decade and computing that will help inform a better experimental design or sampling procedure? What form of iron is best used? You know, iron sulfate was the form of iron that was delivered. That's an inorganic form of iron that we now know most phytoplankton can use, but we also know that phytoplankton often use organic complex forms of iron. So perhaps we can stimulate a bigger, better, more exporty bloom with different forms of iron. Iron sulfate precipitates out rapidly from the surface ocean, so maybe using a form of iron like these iron-coated rice husks that stay suspended in the surface ocean and kind of titrate out iron as the community needs it might fuel a bigger bloom. Most importantly, how do we monitor, report, and verify the carbon that's sequestered? How do we do that accurately and precisely in such a way that it could potentially be commercialized on a carbon market? How do we assess the environmental impacts? How is that done? How do we arrive at a decision-making around what's an acceptable threshold of environmental perturbation or not? And a variety of other social science and governance considerations. So it was a really interesting week and a really interesting set of topics. I don't have time to get into detail, but I'd encourage you to go check out that report that came from it. I've got a QR code in the next slide. But I wanted to call out a couple of specific things that came from these discussions. So the major question is, how long is carbon durably sequestered and how confident can we be? And this plot is showing what we call the centennial ton. And on the y-axis is the length, how long that carbon is sequestered, kind of essentially how deep does it get in the water column. On the y-axis is additionality, how much carbon actually was pulled away from the atmosphere. And when you pull up a lot of carbon, so this is like the surface ocean when you first get a bloom, the additionality above background is high, but the durability of the sequestration is low. And as you move deeper and deeper in the water column, the amount of carbon sequestered is lower, but it's sequestered for longer. And the 95% confidence interval is shown here. When you get our point on this curve where you've got some amount of tons of carbon that are sequestered for 100 years, we defined that as the centennial ton. That's a common term and a common definition that we can now use to develop language around comparing different MCDR techniques or the same type of fertilization that happens in two different regions of the ocean that facilitates the development of this as an actual technology. Another impressive thing that came out of this was a discussion of models called OSSIs, or Observing System Simulation Experiments. And what you have here is a point where you're actually releasing the iron. And in this case, this would be in a flow field that's moving from west to east. And the green is showing what you would anticipate the patch response would be. And the dots are showing points of measurement across that patch field. So what kinds of assets can we deploy in the patch in order to constrain where the additionality is actually coming from and the extent of the impact? And you can use these to design experiments in in silico and guide the experimental design of what happens actually in the field. So you're seeing here is kind of the control, and then this is as you're moving from one across latitudes where you start to visualize the patch. How many assets do you need out? And that really controls the cost you deploy. We have much better assets now than we did 15, 20 years ago, much better autonomous sampling to be able to address these kinds of questions. All right, so here is the path forward document. Again, there's the QR code, but you can just go to oceaniron.org if you want to download it. And moving forward, we articulated in that plan kind of the decadal plan. What are we doing next? And what's the organizational structure of something like an office like EXOIS? What's the role in pushing the state of the science forward? We're in 24, 25. We're going to do some field planning next. We're meeting at the end of May at Woods Hole to talk about actually designing this experiment that we anticipate will happen in the subarctic Northeast Pacific, far away from Station Papa, so as to not interfere with baseline data there, but in that general region. And continued other studies like how do we start to loop in comparisons of the form of iron to then inform future iterations of these field studies at scale if they're decided to be good. But really the fundamental purpose of our group, EXOIS, is to explore the consequences of OIF, positive and negative, so that society can decide with the best science in hand whether or not to implement something like this. You know, from my point of view, I think that even if the answer of all of this work is no, this is still a terrible idea, that's a win, because what we've done then is let the science guide our strategies to potentially mitigate the climate crisis. So I had the idea that I would get into a little bit of my own science here, and actually some of the science that comes out of Scripps. This is Bethany Collity's publication from 2022, and Lisa Ziegler-Allen and Andy Allen are also on this paper, who are here at Scripps. These are barrel experiments that were done to deplete nitrogen and iron in mesocosms, essentially, and to use patterns of gene expression to explore the physiological changes that are happening in the phytoplankton as a result of these perturbations. These types of experiments need to be done also for ocean iron fertilization now. We need to understand and develop tools to assess the community response, and those don't need to wait for big field planning campaigns. So this is a little bit more of my kind of bread and butter in terms of my topical area of expertise, but I wanted to loop this in because if you're a student in this audience or a postdoc, or if you're interested in getting involved in this, you know, what does this effort need? It doesn't need people who are specialists in carbon dioxide removal. It needs observational oceanographers. It needs people who understand the way the ocean works and develop technologies the way that all of you do to apply it to a different question and a different approach. So everything that you're doing in your own research is something that will be valuable if the future of this field ends up developing into something tangible. So I'll end with a brief acknowledgement. I've already mentioned Ken. I also want to mention Paul Morris, who's the EXOIS project manager, and he does an excellent job of herding a lot of cats. And has been a real asset to the team since joining. Our steering committee and then other members, Margaret Leinen, your director here at Scripps, is involved with some of these conversations, was instrumental in developing the code of conduct. Dave Siegel. I want to thank the MLML workshop participants and acknowledge the upcoming field planning participants. And I really want to thank Moss Landing Marine Labs. I think they're tuned in online here, particularly Ivano Aiello, who was the interim director at the time that we held the Moss Landing workshop, was really supportive of that effort. I want to acknowledge all my SIO and JCVA colleagues and co-authors, and also the families of John Martin. His wife, Marlene Martin, is around and is still very involved in activities at Moss Landing Marine Labs and has been really wonderful. I want to acknowledge Kenneth Cole for kind of bringing me into this group and his efforts in pushing this whole field forward, and his family, his son Tyler, who many of you know, and his wife Susan, and then my partner Hans and my new daughter Harbor, who's at home, I think, watching on Zoom, although I don't think she's getting much out of it because she's only 4 months old. So with that, I'm happy to stop, and I'd be very eager to take questions if we have time. And I apologize if I talked too fast, which I have a tendency to do. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Yeah, and I don't have those numbers. I'm, as a non-card carrying biogeochemist, I don't have the accurate numbers right off the top of my head, but it's a lot of the ocean for a little amount of carbon. Current models suggest that it is infeasible at the moment. And I think that that's where the uncertainties come to play. Like the Martin curve is what is being used in many of those models to evaluate export. We know, and actually there was a seminar here not too long ago, Chrissy Hufford, who came and talked about Station M export data. We know that the Martin curve is good on average, but it doesn't capture big export pulse events, and it may not capture deliberately engineered patches to facilitate export. So there may be some room for improvement there in terms of those kind of estimates. The other thing, and I failed to mention this, but it's important to note, is that even people who are pushing OIF forward at this point are not saying OIF and OIF only. OIF may be part of a whole portfolio of approaches to solve this problem. Ocean alkalinity enhancement may be part of it. Blue carbon may be part of it. Emissions reductions is obviously the hugest part of it. So it's not a silver bullet, but it's a silver buckshot. And it may be just a tiny bullet, but even 10 gigatons or 20 gigatons might help if it keeps us under the warming that would otherwise lead to catastrophic biodiversity loss. Yeah. I don't think so. I like the first Iron X experiment, they fertilized the patch and then lost the patch. And what ended up happening was it subducted, and the light attenuation led to a much more muted response than had been anticipated. Diatoms, the big juicy diatoms that suck up all the nitrate in the very surface ocean, are the ones that are the heavy lifters when it comes to carbon sequestration, and they didn't bloom to the same level at a DCM type depth. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you fueled a DCM community, would you promote export the same way you would if you fuel a juicy surface diatom community? I'm not sure. It's an interesting question.
So people online request that I can repeat the questions so they can.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, okay, I'll do that.
So what is
Okay, so the question, Anne's question was, has anyone explored iron fertilization at something at depth, like the deep chlorophyll maximum? And to my knowledge, that was not the case. All the iron was injected at the surface, and I'm not sure if the incubation experiments were done at depth.
There's a question online. Are these iron-induced blooms similar to regular blooms? Are there any noticeable differences?
Good question. The iron-induced blooms are big, juicy diatom blooms. They have been characterized in terms of pigments and with microscopy, but these are offshore communities largely. And to my knowledge, there has been almost probably no molecular work identifying the species that actually end up blooming. So that's an open question. We know that pseudonychia tends to be part of communities that bloom in response to some of these iron additions, whether they're the same coastal pseudonychia bloom species or not. I don't think we have the answer to that. Yeah. Advantages and disadvantages of this method relative to ocean alkalinity? Ooh. So iron fertilization has a longer history than ocean alkalinity enhancement, for better or for worse. It has that seedy, storied example with rogue geoengineers and kind of a history of oceanographers criticizing it. Ocean alkalinity enhancement doesn't have that yet. There is the perception that OAE is a kind of cleaner, more natural way of manipulating the surface ocean. But I would say that if you're increasing alkalinity, you may be shifting the conditions to favor one type of phytoplankton over another. For example, you might be favoring calcifiers in a region of the ocean that previously favored diatoms. And maybe those calcifiers, the export portfolio of them is different, and you're reducing actual carbon export because of that. So all of that is to say that I think that public perception of both of those technologies is really different at this moment in time, but I expect that that will change. In terms of a direct comparison of the state of technology, I can't really do that yet because we don't have good data from either approach at scale. These are still kind of in the early stages and developing the state of technology for both. Hopefully we'll get that soon.
There's no question. Okay, just like send you the question.
Yeah, Mark. Okay. Oh, Mark Oman. Oh, I love an Mark Oman question. You are not making a distinction between carbon export and carbon sequestration. Good point. Previous experiments have shown some evidence for weak carbon export. No experiments have shown evidence for carbon sequestration, and no sequestration equals no benefit. Yes, I agree. It's imperative to keep this in mind and be guided by the precautionary principle. Yes, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. I should be more specific that carbon export does not necessarily mean durable sequestration, and that's incredibly important to be precise about that in this discussion. At least 11.2. Oh man, all the big hitters. Does Exodus have ecosystem modelers? Are you familiar with Tagliabue's study showing nutrient production and potential fish biomass loss in the tropics from OAF? Yes, Exodus, I would say that we're probably at this point weak on higher trophic level ecosystem modelers, but we very much have people with the sensibility that that's an important thing to consider. And I am familiar with Al Tagliabue's study showing that there will be kind of climate change with OIF, there will be climate change winners and losers. And this nutrient redistribution thing may end up reducing the amount of fish biomass in certain regions of the ocean, which is for sure something that should be evaluated and carefully considered. Models are the best way to do that. Jenny Brandon briefly touched on the need for better MRV. What will this look like in the open ocean and deep ocean? Oh, it'll be expensive. We don't know. And part of the goal of conducting this first generation of field studies is to figure out what MRV should look like. How many assets do we need, measuring what with what precision? And it's a little bit of a learn by doing scenario there. But I bet it will be expensive. Obviously, it would be not great if it were super expensive in the long run. And I think models will have to do the work of the heavy lifting eventually. Yeah.
So first of all, congratulations on your efforts. It's very admirable. And thank you. But I have a question here.
Okay.
We all heard about, I don't remember which oil company was taking it. Saw maybe where they had these huge fields of cultivated that I think they were for biofuel purposes. Is there any way, I mean, I don't know how viable those are if they're still functioning, but can you build models off of like artificially creating carbon sequestration?
Yeah.
Using something like that? I mean, considering the alarming rates of global warming and how scary it is, shouldn't those companies kind of?
Yeah, well, yes, lots to unpack there, and that would be great if they did. Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between back of the envelope calculations and proof of principle, and then between actual demonstration. And we can make these calculations based on aerial productivity from those kind of ideal scenarios on land where they've been coddled into being the most productive, nothing's competing with them, nothing's grazing them away. We can use those max productivity estimates to say, okay, if we had this much iron, we may anticipate that level of productivity in the ocean. In reality, the ocean is so complex, and there's not only a variety of biological and ecological factors to contend with, but then there's variables, cloud cover, mixing, all sorts of other factors. So it's a highly, highly interdisciplinary question. And where things fall apart often in the scaling of a technology is between the proof of principle and the actual demonstration. So we're kind of trying to hone in on what we think we know and what actually happens. Yeah.
But is that combined with gas?
Yes.
That kind of just like
100%. Yes, that would be better. Yeah, for those of you who are online, the question is about the centennial ton. Isn't that just kicking the can down the road because in 100 years it will outgas? Yes, absolutely, you're right. Are we at the point where if we buy ourselves 100 years to continue to reduce emissions, that might be helpful or might be valuable? That's maybe not up to the oceanographers to decide, but we can provide that information and let stakeholder groups make those decisions. But that's kind of, you're completely right, is that it is just kicking the can down the road. And ultimately, everything on Earth as a closed system is kicking the can down some length of a road. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. The natural iron fertilization, there are studies in the literature. I'm less familiar with those than I am with some of the deliberate OIF. But there is very good evidence that volcanic eruptions and kind of natural injections of iron stimulate phytoplankton productivity as well. I would say probably we have the export piece of that and sequestration piece of that less well worked out as because of the uncertainties associated with the biological carbon pump. But, I guess I could kind of take the temperature in the room is I believe that ocean iron fertilization is a mechanism with which climate is regulated on Earth by glacial interglacial scales. I mean, knowing what we know about the way that the ocean processes carbon, I believe that that is how it works. That's harder to demonstrate. Do I believe that humans can mimic that and do that as well as the Earth does it on its own anyway? I'm less confident about that. But I think there's a lot to be learned from those natural iron fertilization experiments that could inform more efficient strategies to try and engineer that, if we decide we want to do that. Such great questions. Thank you. It's really fun to talk about this and fun to hear all of these reactions and perspectives. I think the more engagement from the community that we have in these kinds of conversations early on, the more rationally and responsibly we will be able to proceed with this sort of thing and to try and do what we can to stop this giant CO2 train. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming and for signing up for lunch. You guys try to go to the bigger table in front of Sergio.